Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I am talking about the new album from Patricia Taxxon, Visiting Narcissa. Alright, here we go with round 10 of me doing a video on Patricia Taxxon, and in pretty damn close proximity to my last video on her. As usual, you can check the description for the playlist of all the reviews I've done on her over the years, chronicling her growth from a no-name obscure Bandcamp artist to this past March I did a video on her Wax Under Wolkenum album, and in between that video and the release of this album, she's only released one other album, Aeroplane, a pretty solid slice of progressive house that's quite fun and varied all around, but especially picks up from the track Skyhorn onwards. A lot of really nice atmospheric stuff with that one. Don't really have much else to say about it, but yeah, it's quite solid. I think that's the shortest prelude I've ever needed to do for one of these. But yeah, this latest album is obviously much more of a big story for her. She'd really been hyping this one up as her next big step in making straight IDM, inspired by Autechre. Even going as far to say things like this had the potential to be a game changer. It's 13 tracks, adding up to a whopping 87 minutes total, her longest album to date, unless you count Triade Ballet as one album instead of three. She'd been advertising it as a lot more well-varied than her previous attempts in the genre, such as Yes and of course, if you have been following my videos on her previous works, just on that premise alone, this is pretty much specifically designed to appeal to me in particular. I've been pushing for her to make an album exactly like this for quite a long time now. Always felt like she had the potential to pull off a straight IDM album like this that could really resonate with me on that deeper level, since she's proven so many times over at this point how she has the technical chops for it. Even when I already thought she did pull it off when she made Wax Under Wolkenum earlier this year, that album did reach great territory for me, and I thought that one was really well varied and paced, spacing out its IDM experiments with some poppier cuts inspired by experimental hip-hop. But this one was even more exciting for me directly because of the length. I'm well aware that 87 minutes is going to be too much of a commitment for some people, but I've low-key been pushing for an album of this size from her as well. Not even really that low-key. I've always been an active proponent of longer albums like this. While they are riskier to make and will turn out worse if you aren't able to justify the length, if you are able to justify it, it's a lot more likely to resonate with me on that deeper level than something of an equal quality that only runs on the average 40 or 50 minutes. I know it's not a take on album lengths that most people agree with, but most of my favorite albums of all time stretch on for a solid 70 minutes and fill up all the space on a CD. Most of my own albums that I've made sit within that time frame as well. It's no coincidence that Triade Ballet and Pix and Bit are still my two favorite works from Patricia Taxxon to date, her longest and meatiest works, with this album looking to sit within the same tier. And this was all my thought process before hearing the album at all, and before the biggest surprise of all came when she just recently got a cosign from Sean Booth himself. Yes, for real, one of the guys from Autechre, her biggest inspiration, shouted her out during an AMA on Twitch and has openly become a fan. She even said that he had mentioned to her via email that he himself is autistic. He's tried to talk about it in interviews, but they kept cutting around it. God damn. I'm almost feeling like after getting that kind of recognition, what I say in this video doesn't even matter anymore, but I'm already here, so may as well get into my thoughts on the actual album itself. With all that background, Visiting Narcissa was primed to be one of my new absolute favorite projects in her catalog to date. And yeah, I can confirm it is in fact in the same tier for me as Triade Ballet and Pix and Bit. It's an excellent album. As I hoped, it's her most consistently hyper-detailed work to date and her best produced. And despite how formless and abstract every moment is, there's just enough variety throughout for me to feel like the length was in fact justified. Is it my favorite project from her overall, though? No. It's right up there for sure, though for as absolutely through the roof as my expectations were for this thing, this was not an album that knocked my socks off, especially on first listen. See, thing about this album that threw me off at first is that it's not really a step up from previous efforts in terms of its technical prowess. The thing about Patricia Taxxon's work, especially in the last couple of years, is that it feels like she's kept one-upping herself in that department, and kept surprising me by how she keeps improving by leaps and bounds on a production level. Like how Wax Under Wolkenum felt like it was 10 times more detailed and better developed than Yes and, which was only like less than a year apart. Visiting Narcissa, by my ears, is on the same technical level as Wax Under Wolkenum. I feel like any of the abstract IDM cuts from there could seamlessly fit in this album's context and none of them would feel out of place. Kinda had me feel like okay, maybe she's finally hit the ceiling with her sound design. I have seen her mention on Twitter that at this point she's done all the work for creating new sounds and is mostly just restructuring the same sounds she already synthesized before, including some incorporations of random generative elements, and I think that does show. Not to mention this album carries a little bit of that free-flowing jam session feeling that Autechre's post-Quarestus material does. But all that basically means is that instead of this album being a similar point in her catalog to what Confield or Untilted represented for Autechre, Visiting Narcissa is instead her equivalent to Exide, like a grand culmination rather than a new beginning. It may not be anything that she hasn't already proven herself to be capable of, but it is still the best refinement of these particular formulas she's done to date, and obviously if her ceiling in terms of sound design is legit right on par with some of Autechre's best work, that can only be a glowing compliment. And again, this is an 87-minute album that I've had in fairly regular rotation for several weeks, and at no point has that length felt like too overbearing a commitment. Even in my earliest listens where everything was blending together in an incoherent blur of glitchy percussion, thanks to my lack of familiarity, this album was never at any point a chore to get through. So I suppose then it's time to go through individual tracks on this thing. I suppose this album is like a loose concept where, as per the title, the album has you envisioning visiting the house of the wolf lady sitting on the album cover, and she's clearly unfathomably rich and lives in the most extravagant mansion you've ever seen in your life. And each track is named after some room in said mansion, I guess. Although the album is also all instrumental aside from one track that may as well also be treated as instrumental if you want. Things certainly start out pretty intense right from the very first moment in her Foyer, kicking things off with a hyper-dense sea of glitchy percussion that keeps building on more and more layers of different sounds, including these percussive noises that sound somewhere between splashing water and running your hand over a comb. Lots of flashy EDM flavor melodic synth chords coming in through the second half as well. Lets you know exactly what you're getting into and grabs your attention right from the get-go. Although this is functionally just an album intro. Her Kitchen is where the album really starts to get going, I feel like. While not as over-the-top as the opener, it feels like it's structured more like a regular EDM track, switching between bright progressive house-flavored sections with all these really bright synth bell chords and propulsive beats, and other more stripped-back dubstep-ish sections with fuzzy bass stabs and lots of random glitchy percussion details. I hesitate to call these sections build-ups and drops since they don't really feel like they're building up or dropping, they're just like interconnected A and B sections. But I guess there is also kind of like a key change right near the end that could act as a big explosive payoff as well, so there's that too. Lots of fun to be had here. It's like her track Take As Many As You Like got twisted into a meat grinder, came out fairly mangled, but still survived just enough to maintain the same general shape. And that leads directly into her Library, which starts out comparatively toned down with all these tapping percussion noises that sound like lots of clinking silverware, building into some muted chords and eventually picking up a stronger backbeat, echoing bass stabs and wailing lead melodies on top. It's admittedly not one of my big favorites from this album, but whenever those lead melodies come up, I'm like, oh yeah, this one! And I get pulled in just as much as the first two cuts pulled me in. We then get a sort of interlude in her Aviary. It may be 3.5 minutes, but it's also the shortest track in the bunch and feels like an interlude in context. One that sounds quite different from any other track here, a very ornate set of blocky but expansive and imposing sounding synth chords that feels somewhat classical inspired, without any percussion at all. This was a track I wasn't sure how I felt about when I first heard it. These harmonies could occasionally hit a weird spicier note, but again, I'm glad it's here as something to break up the sound of the project. It grew on me with every successive time I heard it. Next comes her Hookah Lounge, which she's described as being a bit of a turning point for the album, and the beginning of a sort of like second act that's sweeter and less about being impressive. Admittedly, also the section of the album that resonated with me the least on average, but still containing lots of interesting ideas. Certainly this track has a more muted and spacious feeling to it than any of the tracks that came before, with its mixes of clattering percussion forming a bit of a bouncier, maybe even funkier sort of groove, with all these hazy trance synth chords and flute-like melodies fading in over time. This track conveys a lot more of a sense of empty space than previous cuts did. Though plays with that space quite a bit over its 9 minutes as it seems to progressively grow and shrink. Pretty interesting cut. And then we get a pair of tracks which seem to directly contrast each other in terms of their synth tones. Her Pool obviously has much more of a liquid and watery feel to its bubbling synth textures that float up and down. They do in fact feel like you're being submerged underwater, aided by a few blips that have a lot more reverb on them and sound like submarine radar sound effects, and some shuffling percussion that is a bit lighter and maybe sandier than those on other cuts. And the flip side to this track is Her Breaker Room, which unsurprisingly focuses a lot more on all these flashy and brittle synth chords that sound like electric sparks going off all over the place. And more mechanical percussion textures and some wiry drops of intense buzzing bass and a tremolo-covered lead, eventually leading to an outro of all the synth cores just wavering in and out of reality like intense power surges that make all the lights flicker on and off. Between these two cuts, I do prefer Her Pool, but in a weird way they don't feel complete without each other. But next up we have Her Garage, which is probably my personal favorite cut in the bunch. It's an 8-minute cut split into two very distinct halves. The first half is nothing but all these mechanical clanking and heaving noises. It's very abstract, it's very formless. But as time goes on, the clanking slowly starts to form more of a coherent groove, and the whole mix just keeps subtly building up more and more until paying off at, I think, exactly the 4-minute mark with a complete shift in sound. All the mechanical clanking acting as background texture and bass behind a much brighter and more cheerful mix of light synth melodies and banging 6/8 beats. Quite possibly the most easily danceable moment in the whole album. Structure-wise, it kinda reminds me of the Monolake track Amazon, where there's just like this really long toned down build up and then a much stronger drum groove comes in like right at the halfway mark and then totally switches up your preconception of what the track was about this whole time. Excellent track here. Next up we got Her Powder Room, and this is the above mentioned track that's not instrumental. We got a half mumbled rap verse from Scum Jones, the same rapper who showed up on her track Digital Counterpoint and killed it. He does sound a little out of place on this album, and on this track in particular, which instrumentally is full of all these high-pitched twinkling synths. Also, I can't understand half of what he's saying between his mumbling and his voice getting all stuttered and glitched up to further obfuscate what's being said. I might have heard a reference to cops kneeling on necks and him maybe winning an Emmy if he wanted, but I get the feeling that what he's saying really doesn't matter, especially given the lyrics aren't even listed at all on the Bandcamp page. He's just being treated as an extra instrumental texture to add some darker grit to the lighter instrumental. But this track is directly built to segue into the following cut, Her Wine Cellar. The transition is so smooth on most listens I didn't realize I'd entered into a new track until like 2 minutes in. Though Patricia has also described this track as also representing the beginning of a third act for the album that's meant to sound a lot more intimate than the previous cuts. I don't know if intimate is quite the word I would use, as this part of the album feels like a return to the more extra and over-the-top mixes that the album started with, but we do get a whole bunch of the best cuts from this point onwards, which are markedly brighter and more positive sounding on average than the stuff that came before. Her Wine Cellar itself starts out with a clanking beat that, as I mentioned, seems to directly continue from where the last track left off, with some jangling percussion textures that seem to call back to the sounds of the earlier parts of the album. But about 2 minutes in, we do hear all these really nice pianos fading in, and some more of those brighter flute-like lead melodies on top, which does all add up to this track feeling lighter and more welcoming than any track up to this point in the album. If Her Garage is my favorite cut, I think this one's my second favorite. There's another 3-minute sort of interlude in Her Topiary that didn't stick out to me at first, but grew on me a lot more as I listened to this album more. A lot of light and breezy, high-pitched melodic progressions going over a fairly bouncy little beat. One of the comparatively more straightforward-sounding cuts in the bunch. So not that straightforward, but you know. It's like a bit of a brief breather before we dive into the album's longest and most fleshed-out cut of all, the 12-minute epic climax that is Her Bed. Because of course the album climaxes with her bed. But yeah, this track is obviously the most impressive and detailed one yet, starting out fairly low-key with the somewhat unnerving bass pads and screechy metallic glitch effects in the background, building up more and more layers of fast-paced percussion textures as we go on. This section of the track does meander on a long time without feeling like it's going anywhere for a while, but once again, the track turns around at about the halfway point, with some light but triumphant major key synth melodies very slowly fading in and enveloping the entire mix, building up further and further, until finally stopping that build up a little before the 10-minute mark as the percussion becomes a lot more formless, the melodies are reduced to just the highest pitched twinkling It's not really sustained chord on top, and then just slowly dying down. It's quite a lot. It certainly lives up to what you would want out of a track of that length, taking up the penultimate spot in the album. And then finally, we close with Her Rooftop. Another track that needed to grow on me, primarily thanks to a less exciting opening stretch, with all these synth blips repeating a single note over and over, and an odd feeling of emptiness compared to pretty much any other cut in the album. Although, of course, the melodies and chord progressions that do slowly fade in did win me over, as they do feel like they carry the emotional weight you'd want out of a finale like this, and once again the track does really pick up in its second half, as a more present beat is introduced with these more full-sounding lead melodies, and eventually some actual bass that is like really satisfying and triumphant when it finally shows up. So yeah, that's everything on Visiting Narcissa. I really don't have much to complain about here across the board. As I'd expect at this point, the production is absolutely stellar, and there's so much detail over every second. Even when these tracks can feel a bit long-winded or slower to progress, they keep varying their sound to prevent anything from getting boring. It's just as much of an impressive achievement for Patricia Taxxon as she was advertising it to be. Easily her best and most well-realized IDM project to date, and most likely going to sit among my favorite projects she's made to date overall. It does not reach 9 out of 10 territory for me, though, for pretty much the same reason that her idols Autechre have never made an album that I would personally score in the 9 range, and it's that I do feel a little emotionally distant from this project. Less so than I tend to be on average for Autechre albums. There's still lots of present, brighter melodies in her usual style and the same kind of emotional core that sits behind pretty much all of her albums. But this is still very much an album that I'm just here for how it connects with me intellectually and to appreciate the craft of everything than something that like really viscerally connected with me on a deeper level. If this album is supposed to see the listener envisioning themselves inserted within its universe and interacting with the character on the cover, my asexual ass walked right past the furry character on the cover and just admired whatever cool MC Escher-like architecture her house is made out of. The Triage Ballet albums may not be as heavily detailed or as far along production-wise as this one is, but I thought they balanced out their intellectual side with the deeper emotional core better. But that obviously didn't stop this project from being an absolute ton of fun to dive into and digest all the finer details within every corner. I know the majority of my followers are big Autechre fans, and if you are a fan of those guys, I can't imagine you couldn't get into this just as well. Maybe it'll even connect with you more deeply. Like I said, Sean Booth himself is openly a fan of hers now, so that'll tell you all you need to know. I suppose if you're not an IDM fan at all and don't enjoy these kinds of hyperdense regular rhythms in any capacity, this isn't gonna connect with you. But if you are like maybe a more surface level IDM fan and you were like how I used to be with Autechre and felt like their music is too far out there to connect with, this might still be worth a shot anyway. It's got their level of attention to detail and cerebral ethos, but attached to a slightly more approachable palette of sounds. Perhaps sitting somewhere in between their sound and what artists in the upscale adjacent scene like False Noise and Comadusser and Coan Sound and all those have accomplished. And again, don't worry about the length. It's a lot less intimidating than it might look on the surface. As usual, we'll see how this fares for me replay value-wise and whether this grows on me even further months or years to come. Again, this has been the kind of project that I've needed to sit with for a while to really click with me to its fullest potential, but at the end of it all, for the most part, this lived up to the lofty expectations I had set for it. Is probably at least gonna nab a spot somewhere on my year-end list, and I can give it an 8.5 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.